Welcome to the Doggy Dojo podcast. I'm your host, Susan Light, a Los Angeles-based dog trainer on a quest to become worthy of the title Sensei of the Doggy Dojo. Today's episode is something I think every single person with a dog should listen to. I think it's the most important issue in dog training at the moment. Does method matter? Spoiler alert, yes! Yes, it does. I'm talking about the difference between positive reinforcement or rewards-based training method versus a method that includes punishment, aversives, and what sometimes is called balanced training methods. It can be really confusing, so I got the most amazing guest to help us sort through it. She is a PhD, a Certified Applied Animal Behaviorist, Certified Professional Dog Trainer, and an award-winning author of 6 books about canine training and behavior, including her most recent, Treat Everyone Like a Dog, How a Dog Trainer's Worldview Can Improve Your Life. She blogs for thebark.com and thewildest.com, writes the animal column for the Arizona Daily Sun, and is an adjunct professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Northern Arizona University. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Karen London. Hi, Karen. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Susan. Thanks for having me.
We're here to talk about why methods matter in dog training. We're hoping to advocate the use of positive reinforcement or reward-based training, not just by saying you should do it, but talking about the why and the how. I feel like a lot of people turn to aversive or punishment in training out of misinformation, desperation, or frustration. Too many people have been using these techniques for too long for them to just disappear, but I hope we can lay out a reasoned argument backed by evidence why you should stick to reward-based methods. Now, terminology and buzzwords are ever evolving and sometimes confusing or purposely misleading, so we're not going to get really hung up on words, but I want to start our discussion with some definitions and lay the foundation for what we mean when we compare methods and techniques. So I would like to start by defining the 4 quadrants for everybody.
And the 4 quadrants of behavior in terms of training and learning theory are so important because they really lay out all the different ways that we can influence behavior. So positive reinforcement, which is the one that I think most people think of when they think of training dogs, means that the dog's behavior leads to something good. So the dog does something we like, we give them something that makes them glad they did it, which makes them more likely to do it. So you can kind of think of positive reinforcement making the dog say, yay, like that was worth doing. Positive punishment is what most people tend to think of when they think of punishment. That means that the dog's behavior makes something bad happen. Like they jump up at the counter and somebody yells at them and then they don't like that, so they don't do that again. So, and some positive punishment can be really cruel. It's all aversive, but it can be cruel. And so that's why I tend to think of positive punishment as ouch. Like if someone did something really, really physically mean to the dog, it would make them say ouch. Yeah. Negative reinforcement is when the dog's behavior causes something bad to stop. So if somebody were holding the dog's leash really tight and then the dog relaxed, then they would have more freedom. So it offers them relief from something that's bothering them. That's negative reinforcement.
And you can think of like a prong collar.
Yeah, a prong collar works in that category. Or for humans, when we put our seatbelt on, the buzzing seatbelt sound stops. That's, to me, the easiest human example of negative reinforcement. It's like, I'll do anything to make that horrible sound stop. Actually, trying to get babies to stop crying is based on negative reinforcement a lot, too. It's like, what do I have to do to make this stop? That's negative reinforcement and offers relief. And then negative punishment is that the dog's behavior causes something good to stop. So they're doing something, say, and they're eating treats out of your hand, and then they accidentally get your hand, little crocodile teeth, and then we remove the treats. And I think of the negative reinforcement as sort of making the dog go, oh, shoot, I wish I hadn't done that. It went away. So I tend to think of it as sort of yay, ouch, relief, and shoot are my 4 quadrants. And in the positive ones are something that you add in. Positive reinforcement, you add treats. Positive punishment, you add something mean. And then the negative ones, you're removing something away. And reinforcement makes something more likely to happen in the future, the behavior, and punishment makes something less likely to happen in the behavior, in terms of the behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we say reinforcement drives behavior, we're saying what gets reinforced gets repeated. That's that's the basic of a lot of our, when we're saying positive reinforcement, we want to reinforce the things we want to see repeated. But we're here mostly to talk about what people tend to focus on, which is punishing what they don't want the dogs to do. And yes, so it's confusing because there's negative punishment and there's positive punishment. We're mostly talking about positive punishment here. And because the definition of punishment just means that what you've punished them for is less likely to be repeated. It's not always our choice what a dog finds punishing or a person finds punishing.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. If, say, a child comes up and hugs a relative, which is a behavior that most of us would like our children to do if they're comfortable doing it, and that relative pinches their cheeks, that's a punishment, but the relative probably doesn't mean it that way. Kids don't generally like to have their cheeks pinched. I know I didn't, and it made me less likely to want to hug relatives. But it wasn't that was actively being done as punishment. It just functioned as that. Just like in dog training, if you call your dog to come and then either leash your dog up or pat your dog on the head, two generally unliked consequences, that's actually punishing your dog and making it less likely that the behavior you want, coming when called, happens. So we don't necessarily mean those things as punishment, but if it's punishing to the dog, if it's a consequence that makes what they just did that caused that to happen less likely to happen, then it is positive punishment, whether we meant it that way or not. And hopefully we're not ever purposely trying to use it, but sometimes just in interactions socially with our own or other species, there are punishing things that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's something to really keep in mind as we're going through this whole thing. If you're saying, oh, that's not a punishment or that is a reward, if your dog's not repeating what you've rewarded them for, they don't find it rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely. You know? It's so true. And I mean, I think when we talk about reinforcement, and by that we mean positive reinforcement, driving behavior, we're saying that if our dog receive as a consequence something they like, they're going to be more likely to do that behavior. But the consequence is always relative to the individual. So if you have a dog that, doesn't like squeaky toys and you offer them a squeaky toy, it's not reinforcing. If someone offers me mint candy, it's not reinforcing because I don't like peppermint. So they might mean it well and I'd appreciate the effort, but that's about it. I'm not like, yay, I'll do that for more peppermint candy in the future because I don't like it.
Yeah. Absolutely. But let's talk about, those are times that we're sometimes punishing our dogs without intending to, but we're really here to talk about the times that people are punishing their dogs, positive punishment on purpose to get them to stop the things that they don't want them to do. So let's talk about, you'll just run down the list of when we say positive punishment, what are the most common forms used in dog training?
Well, just to be clear, my dog training is about positive reinforcement. I certainly have clients come to me that have been using punishment. I just want to be clear that's not something I ever intend to use. I don't use it for reasons that I'm sure we'll be getting into, but it's really hard on the relationship and it's not kind. But the most common things that I think people do are they yell at their dog. A lot of dogs will cower and get distressed. And even though it's not a physical punishment, it's distressing to a lot of dogs, depending on their personality, more or less so, but generally distressing to dogs. People will also give a leash jerk or a leash pop, which is painful and unpleasant and startling and scary to dogs. Yep. They might make a really loud noise, like throw something that is really, loud, like just, like a can or a shoe.
I was literally taught a can full of nickels, like a shaker can. They're like, just shake the can of nickels at them.
Yeah, many years ago, that was very common. It's become less so, but it's not totally gone yet. People will use, like a choke collar to hurt their dog. And then some people will actually physically, hit or kick their dog. That is not very common. I mean, I don't have clients telling me they've been advised to do that or that they do that. And I don't see that, but once in a blue moon with some very upset person at a park, and it's just, heartbreaking.
Absolutely. But
I think yelling and like a leash pop, pulling really hard on the leash, jerking the leash, are the two most common.
Yeah, and the ones that everybody used to think was really innocuous, like rolling up a newspaper and bopping them with it, or rubbing their nose in pee that they peed on the carpet, those kinds of things. Those are also just outdated positive punishment, I think. But yeah, beyond just the popping, which you could do on a flat collar, choke collar, prong collar, and shock collars, which are lovingly called e-collars these days.
Right, for electronic. Yeah. And I mean, I live in the United States, but certainly there are many countries, and I don't know the exact list, but those are actually.
I have the list.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Shock collars. Yep.
They're banned. A lot of places have banned shock collars. It hasn't happened in this country, but it certainly is indicative of the dangers and harm that they can cause, that there are many countries who are just, they were just illegal there for good reason.
Denmark, Germany, Switzerland, Slovenia, Austria, and then parts of Australia and Quebec in Canada have outlawed shock collars.
Excellent.
Yeah. So these are what we're talking about. These are the things that we don't personally use. And again, when I say I was taught to use a shaker can, that was when I took my certification from Animal Behavior College. This is literally like, they taught us the 4 quadrants and they're like, oh, you should try this first. But if you need to, here are these methods. And so they were actually teaching people when they're certifying dog trainers to use positive punishment in various forms, which is a shame. And now I realize kind of how outdated that curriculum is. But I didn't back then. So that's kind of the problem, is these things are not changing with the times. And so some people are using these techniques because they think they work. They think they're not harmful to dogs. So I love that we're going to talk about some new research. They finally started doing specific research about the use of these techniques and their consequences with dogs.
Yeah, I think it's so important. And what I think is really exciting is that some of the research is focusing on, on different kinds of techniques. Like a lot of the research on showing that it was stressful and painful and damaging to dogs to use these kinds of punishments. A lot of them really focused on incredibly, harsh techniques, like using shock collars or using a choke chain. But in a more recent study, they looked at things, they compared, using play and treats versus like yelling, jerking on the leash, and forcing dogs into positions, which are also positive punishment. But many people said, oh, well, it's pretty mild. This is a study done in Porto, Portugal. And the researcher's name is Ana Catarina Vieira de Castro, which I think is such a great name.
Impressive.
And her work, they looked at almost 100 dogs, roughly half that were being trained in training centers that used play and treats to get the behavior they wanted, and roughly half of them at training centers that did yelling, leash pops, and then physically manipulating the dogs into position. And I don't get the feeling they're like slamming them and causing physical pain to the dogs, just to be clear. It was just they're putting them into the positions. And then they videotaped these training sessions, and they found a whole bunch of interesting things. So they found that the dogs who were punished, and that included by forcing them into the positions they wanted, they showed more signs of stress during training than dogs who are trained with positive methods. And that the kind of things that they looked at very typical measures of stress behaviors, like lip licks, yawning, and panting. And they found that the dogs who were trained with this punishment were also more frequently in an overall tense state, like their bodies were tense. And they showed more yelping and lying on the side or the back, which can be a behavior, an appeasement behavior meant to sort of stop someone from basically bullying them, or crouching. And those dogs that were treated less well like that also had higher levels of cortisol, which is a common measure of stress, than they did at home. So they compared their cortisol levels during training and at home, and at training it was more stressful. And the dogs trained positively didn't show any differences. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about this study and so important isn't just that the dogs were stressed during training, but that it actually affected their outlook on life. And there are ways to measure what they consider pessimism or optimism in dogs. And I love this. So they this is sort of like a glass half full kind of test. Like, do you view it as glass half full or glass half empty? And so there were 92 dogs in the original study. And then they looked at 79 of these dogs. And they trained these dogs that if they put a bowl on one side of the room, it had treats or food in it. And if they put it on the other side, it was empty. And so the dogs learned that pretty quickly. They obviously learned like, oh, this is where the food shows up. I'll go there. But if they put a bowl in between it, so the idea was that optimistic dogs would be like, oh, well, maybe that's on the side of the room that has food. And the others might be like, maybe that's on the side of the room that doesn't. And the optimistic dogs, which was far more likely to be the ones that were trained positively, were faster to approach the bowl. And the pessimistic dogs approached more slowly. Like perhaps they were nervous about what might be there, or they certainly weren't hopeful
Right.
that the food was there. And I think it's pretty cool to show that it affected their whole outlook on life. And also just that, that even things like yelling, which I'm not condoning, but it's obviously not as scary and dangerous as like giving them electric shocks, still is very damaging to the dog's well-being and to, how they feel about life in general.
Absolutely. And I think something that stuck out to me from that study was, they said this was one of the first studies to evaluate the effects of training on their welfare outside of training. And they referenced a study from 2001 that had found there was no effect of shock collar on training on the dogs having fear or anxiety. But that was based on the dog owners' reports instead of objective tests and animal-based welfare indicators like the one that you're talking about. So that's literally asking the owner, like, hey, is your dog okay? Have to use the shock collar on him? And they're like, yeah, it's fine. And it's like, I think it's a good indication that people don't always understand canine body language enough, because what they've done in this study that you're talking about is they videotaped the dogs. They had them look for these indications in their body languages of stress. And then, like you said, they put them through this test to determine how they feel. It's just, and they tested their cortisol as well. So it's like all these factors, they're not just taking the owner's perspective, but it's important to know that sometimes as the owners, you kind of think these things are okay and they're not doing any damage to your dog, and they are. You're just, unfortunately, you're not in tune enough to see it.
It's so true what you're saying, that it's very objective measures in this study out of Portugal, and many of the other studies they're like, oh yeah, he's fine. And there are two problems. That one is, as you say, people might not know that when their dog's yawning, that their dog is stressed, or if their pads are sweating, or if their body is tense.
The big smile, everybody's like, oh, they're smiling, they're so happy. They're stressed.
Right. It could be a fear grimace. If the corners of their mouth are pulled really far back, it can be a sign of fear. But since their teeth are showing, but they're not like baring their teeth, it can be confused. And I think another issue with previous studies that did rely on owner assessments of their dogs is that then you can possibly be skewing the data, because suppose there's 100 dogs that they've used e-collars on, and it's aversive. I think that we all, that you and I both agree on that, but it might be more aversive to some dogs than others. I mean, some dogs might, based on their personality and how, high a level they're doing on it, some dogs might not like it, but it might not be catastrophically traumatic for them. And those owners might keep using them. If you put a shock collar on the dog and the dog shrieks and squeals and defecates and, hides under the bed for 2 days, most people who are not,
horrible,
horrible, cruel people are going to be like, this is a problem for my dog. And I do think a lot of people who use these collars, and I would never want someone to, I'm always opposed to it. Absolutely. I think they don't know. Like someone's like, oh, I did this with my dog and it worked, or this helps, or like, oh, you got to do this. And they do it and maybe they don't feel great about it, but only if their dog gives these really obviously clear signals of distress that are like heartbreaking for people, do they stop. And then some of the others might be like, maybe the dog flinches or the dog whines a little, but then they just kind of take it. And it doesn't mean that it's okay, but it means the dog is not illustrating in a very obvious way how horrible it is. And then those people keep using it. And those might be the ones reporting in the study. And I don't know, I'm not saying this did happen in these studies. I'm saying there's always that possibility. We just don't know. Those data don't seem that clean to me.
I agree. And also I feel like I've heard, again, this is from people who are discussing using e-collars and how great they are, is they'll talk about like the levels, and they're like, some dogs are hard and you have to really, for instance, I know this was floating around Instagram a while ago of trainers who are putting shock collars around a dog's waist. So like, if your dog really doesn't respond, and you sometimes have to take it to another level. I mean, at that point, you're using the shock collar on their bare skin, like that's much more sensitive to their neck. It's abuse. And most people in the community agreed on that. But I mean, these are the levels they're taking it up to. They're saying, oh, we're not getting through. It's obviously not hurting. Let's hurt them more until we can get through. I mean, I'm off on a tangent, which I didn't want to get off on, but.
No, but it's important to understand that, I mean, to really think and empathize with how painful this is to dogs, and the fact that people are choosing to cause their dogs pain in the name of training for teaching. It's not something that obviously you and I are comfortable with, but it's important to talk about as long as there are people out there who are still doing it. And there are very few people who are just mean, but most people just really, if we show them a better way and they understand why another way is better, I think a lot of people are happier to know that there's a way. I think a lot of people use these, as you said earlier on, out of desperation.
Yeah.
Like there's some behavior of their dogs that is making life very challenging with them or causing conflict in their relationship with other people, and they've got to get it to stop, whether it's barking or eliminating indoors or, and they're people are just at the end of their rope. I'm very sympathetic to people that have tried this out of desperation, although I really wish they wouldn't. And what we need to do is, hopefully what we're doing a little today, is getting more education out there. The more people know of other techniques and how effective they can be, the more willing they are to try them. I don't think there are very many people out there that want to cause their dog pain. I think that's thankfully a very, very, very small minority, but more people are doing it than actually want to.
Yes, because either desperation, which we're going to talk about, people who believe that they've tried positive reinforcement and it didn't work, but also just, I think, like you said, misinformation. They don't think it's bad. What's sad is like these videos. I was watching a video, it came up through my feed today, of a local trainer using a shock collar for recall. And it's like she's like, you just call it back with the collar. Like, she didn't even call the dog to come, didn't even give it a chance. She just like shocked it and it came back. And she was showing this video to be like, look how well I've trained this dog to come back from 50 feet away without a leash.
Right. But the problem with that, it's terrible misinformation. I feel really sorry for that dog. But when you look at that from a behaviorist point of view, the person wants the dog to come back. That's what they desire. So when they, hit that whatever knob or switch or whatever that makes the collar shock and the dog comes back, they are being reinforced that I want my dog to come back. When I do this, that happens. So they themselves are being positively reinforced for it. It's no wonder that they keep doing it. Yeah. Because it's very cruel to the dog, but the person is getting what they want. Mm-hmm. Obviously I don't think they necessarily want to hurt their dog, but I don't think that's the part they're thinking of. They're thinking of the dog's behavior, and they're getting the behavior they want from their dog. So they keep doing what they've been doing to get that happen. That's the power of positive reinforcement. It's just that in this case, it's not working for us in the way that we might most desire.
Yeah. We have to take a short break. There are links in the show notes to Dr. London's Instagram, Facebook, and to purchase her newest book, Treat Everyone Like a Dog. We'll be right back. So the conclusion of that study that we were just talking about, which is a very recent study, it was published in December 2020. So this is very current research that we're talking about. Results showed that dogs from group aversive displayed more stress-related behaviors, were more frequently in tense and low behavioral states, panted more during training, exhibited higher post-training increases in cortisol levels than dogs in group reward. Additionally, dogs from group aversive were more pessimistic in the cognitive bias task. That's the one you were talking about with the bowls.
Yes.
That's the cognitive bias task. Then dogs from group reward. Dogs from group mixed, so that they actually found that some of the trainers, when they split these groups apart to do the study, used a little bit of aversive techniques, but far less than the other ones. So they decided to call it group mixed. We'd probably call it a balanced trainer is the other, again, nomenclature they like to use. So this is one that uses some aversive, but not as much. Group mixed displayed more stress-related behaviors, were more frequently in tense states, and panted more during training than dogs in group reward. Furthermore, although groups mixed and aversive did not differ in their performance in the cognitive bias task, nor in cortisol levels, the former displayed more stress-related behaviors and was more frequently in tense and low behavioral states. The findings indicate aversive-based training methods, especially if used in high proportions, compromise the welfare of companion dogs, both within and outside the training context. So that is the result of that study. Do you agree with it?
Well, I've definitely, read that study and found those results. What I think so interesting about it is that the idea that the mixed training causes issues. I think that's counterintuitive to a lot of people, but it makes sense if you think about, in addition to the idea that those dogs are receiving aversive, punishing, painful, and scary experiences, they're unpredictable. Mm-hmm. And I think that is I think that's been well documented behaviorally with a number of species, that unpredictability causes stress.
Yeah. Dogs love patterns.
They love pattern, routine, predictability. The one thing I'd like to say just about research is I think that there are many of us, and I would put myself in this group, that long before really good, reliable studies came out and offered strong evidence that aversive techniques, punishment-based methods were bad for dogs, I believe that to be true. I knew there weren't a lot of data, but I just see that when there are people who work with their dogs and they use positive methods and they're not trying to influence behavior with fear or pain, it doesn't defy, common sense or, like imagination, that those relationships are stronger and better, and that dogs are free to explore and offer behaviors. And that's one of the reasons that it works so much better, is that dogs aren't afraid to try something because there's no risk of punishment. It's part of what makes positive training so powerful, so effective, and so good for relationships isn't just the actual power of the positive reinforcement, but actually the absence of punishment. Which is obviously sounds like that's the same thing, but it's actually not. And that's why that one where people say, oh, I do positive if I use treats, but if they're also using punishment, it's quite potentially stressful for the dogs. And so I think it's important that a lot of people have strong feelings about what kind of training methods are best. And it's really nice to see data out there offering strong support for what a lot of people have known for a long time, people who are empathetic and caring and recognize the dog's value, that the kind that, it matters to be kind in your training.
Absolutely. Well said. Absolutely. Could not agree more. I guess we're hopeful that the research will sort of sway some of the people that are like heavily entrenched in these aversives. And I can't talk about this without going down some of these, arguments for using punishment that I hear all the time, because I just want to answer to them so that people understand that we're not just sticking our head in the sand. We hear all of these, and we're going to talk about why they still don't convince us to use these. So the top one is they work. They're like, why shouldn't I use the shock collar? It works. Or the prong collar, that's a big one. You got a really big dog dragging you down the street, and it's really tough to teach them, in their adolescence to walk nicely on the leash. The temptation to throw a prong collar on them is strong. I get it. And a lot of people are like, it works. It works. I put it on it. They walk better. Why can't I do it? So,
right. And again, this fits into the idea that it's reinforcing to the person, but it doesn't mean it's good for the dog. And I think that the idea that aversive and punishing and painful or fearful methods can work is really important to address, because Skinner showed with his rats in those boxes in the 1950s and, for many years, you can teach things with fear and pain.
Oh, yeah.
My concern with these techniques isn't that they don't work, because there's no doubt that you can teach individuals of just about any species how to do something or not to do something with fear or pain. I mean, school teachers have, caned children or humiliated them by putting them in the corner with a dunce cap, or slapping their hands with a ruler, or yelling at them. And just like, unfortunately, dog trainers, similar things dog trainers have done more back in the day, but still some now. You can teach individuals to do things with that, but at what cost? My issue isn't that it doesn't work, but that it's bad for the individual's well-being. A dog that's treated poorly in training, it's bad for their well-being, their sense of safety, their self-esteem, and their connection to the person or people causing these things. It's not good for the relationship. And to me, training and the relationship is this wonderful feedback loop where the better your relationship is, it's easier, the easier it is to train them. And the better you train them and the more you can communicate with each other and understand what you want, the better the relationship is. And that should cycle in a very positive way. And if within that interaction, there's fear or pain caused by the person to the dog, that absolutely obliterates relationship building and all the benefits of that, both for training and for your life together and just enjoyment of each other. So again, I just can't state strongly enough that my objection to using punishment in training is not that it doesn't work, but that the costs are far too strong to make whatever effect it could have that could be useful for teaching not to be worth it.
Absolutely. So also I'd like to add to that, because that's the crux of it. In the end, that anybody that believes that you should, whatever hashtag you use, train humane, positive reinforcement, whatever, that's the crux of it, is that it's damaging to your relationship, and that is the big deal. But I would also say that punishment teaches your dog what you don't want them to do. It doesn't teach them what they want to do. So all it does is shut down behavior. And a lot of behaviors are done from fear. And that's where we see them do the most damage, is that if you're shutting down fear behaviors, but the dog is still afraid, then you end up with an aggressive dog because they feel backed in a corner and they need to defend themselves because they don't feel safe. So that's a different episode. But I would say that punishment works by shutting down behavior. And like you said, you want a dog that has personality, that offers you behaviors, that's not afraid to try things, as opposed to the dog that's just like, I'm going to sit in this corner so that I don't get whacked.
Yeah, it's so true. A lot of times when people see what they're saying is a dog who's not misbehaving, I don't think that's accurate if they've been, punished. It's not so much that they're not misbehaving, it's that they're not behaving. As you say, they're shut down. So yeah, they may not be doing anything problematic, but it might be because they're just not doing anything, because anything they do based on their experience offers the risk of being punished. Yep. And so there's not a sort of a vibrancy or a joyfulness in their actions because there's always that apprehension.
Yes. So yes, if that's your definition of a well-behaved dog, I mean, that's a little bit of its own problem.
I agree.
I think we have a little bit of bad expectation of what we want these animals that we've invited to share our homes and lives to do and not to do. So moving on from that, because again, another episode maybe. The other things that people say about it is that they're easier and faster than using positive reinforcement.
Yeah, this argument has always befuddled me a little bit because I think that it is very difficult to do any kind of training. It takes a lot of skill, and I think that you can affect behavior very quickly if a dog learns that good things happen when they do a particular behavior, and they seem to be incredibly willing to do that. And I don't see where just shutting down behavior or just scaring a dog till they essentially freeze is any indication that using that to influence behavior to get what you want is actually easier. I think one of the great things about using positive reinforcement is that it's pretty, we all make mistakes where the dog does something you don't want, and that's right when you drop a treat and they get it. So they get reinforced for something you don't want. But I think that can so easily be overcome. It's like, all right, well, we just have to work on getting the reinforcement timed properly. But if you do some kind of a punishing thing to the dog at the wrong time, that can be incredibly damaging. So I feel like little mistakes in positive reinforcement training are far easier to recover from. And that's part of training is, nobody does it perfectly, is fixing a little mistake that you've made. And I think that's much easier with positive techniques than with aversive ones.
You are so right. And that leads me directly into the next one, which is it's not harmful if you, in putting this in quotes, do it right. And this is a big argument that they always say. They're like, oh, well, I know how to do it right, so I apply it correctly at the right moment and at the right level, and the dog understands it immediately and it doesn't hurt, they just learn. I think that's just a big mistake that people have, is I don't think unless you've trained as many dogs as we have, and I know you've trained more than I have for sure, that you can understand how important timing is. And like you said, sometimes we make mistakes and we accidentally, our timing's a little off, our mechanics are a little off, we reinforce the wrong thing. But let me promise you, also on the other end, you are punishing the wrong thing. And sometimes the big mistake with punishment is that you don't always decide what the dog's associating with that punishment.
Right. And I'm sure there are people that do it in more or less damaging ways. It's all damaging in my opinion, but some could be worse, just like any kind of, negative experiences all of us have, or heaven forbid, really abusive experiences. There are degrees of it. But it's all harmful. And I think that it's important to remember when people talk about, like you say, they don't talk about a shock collar, they call it an e-collar, or they talk about it's a prong collar, but it doesn't really choke. Right. You can use the vibrate. It's all based on fear and pain. And if you're only using vibrate in the training, vibrate is often used to predict the shock. The vibrate's causing fear because it previously has predicted a shock. Any kind of training or education that's based on fear and pain has the potential to be hugely damaging to that individual and to the relationship. Sure, some people have done some of these techniques and it hasn't been as damaging as what some other dogs have done, but that's like saying, well, I was only in a car accident that, smashed up the front of my car. Like I know people that have been in car accidents where their front and their back was smashed up, so mine's not a problem. It defies logic. Just because there are things that are more damaging or some people have done it more cruelly or caused more pain or more damage doesn't mean that the less pain or the less damage is not damaging or painful or fearful, because it is. So that, yes, there are degrees, but it's never that it's not damaging if it's done right. It's that it can be more or less damaging depending on how intense it is in the individual of the dog. But it's very alarming to see any dog being treated cruelly like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Which brings us to LIMA. So LIMA stands for Least Intrusive, Minimally Aversive. And it's something that, I just got my CPD TKA. I had to sign it and file it with them to say that I'll follow LIMA standards. Basically, it's a ladder of behavior modification that starts with, veterinary care and management, positive reinforcement. But it does say in LIMA, it's like, oh, if that doesn't work, you can keep going and try, all the way up to positive punishment and all the steps in between. And that's another thing. Again, I was taught when I got my first certification, the ABCDT, it's like, oh, try that first. And if it doesn't work, then go to the punishment and try that. There's a problem with that way of thinking. I mean, I like at least that they're trying to push people to start positive. And I think that's where all of this, it was the first step. But, positive reinforcement can work. You shouldn't have to go up the ladder to any of the other ones.
Right. And what I like about this general idea is that it does acknowledge that there's risk with aversive or intrusive kinds of things. But yeah, I mean, when you're teaching and training, I don't see any reason to move from the positive. I do think the idea of LIMA is beneficial if, like, suppose you've got an emergency health situation with a dog, like a dog that is, choking, or a dog that needs to be moved immediately to get to veterinary care. And you may do something that causes them distress. You may just sometimes have to lift them up, carry them in the car, even though it hurts them because you have to do it. So in that context, but that's not teaching or training. That's just handling emergencies. So I know that's not how LIMA's generally been intended, but that's where I see the value of it.
So why did we ever get started using punishment in training?
It's such a great question. And I feel like, and I think I have views that might differ from other people's, but I feel like we started training dogs the way, people worked with their horses, and the way people taught children in school, with a certain amount of force for authority. And of course, that blends into the idea when we talk about authority with dogs, with sort of mistaken ideas about alpha theory and dominance, based on some, ideas that came from other canines that we no longer think hold true for, frankly, even those canines, much less the domestic dog. Yeah.
I think that's a good point, because a lot of the things that clients say to me, one is like, oh, they should do it for not treats. They should just do it because they want to make me happy. Or, they have to, I don't know. It amazes me sometimes. I do think people think they need to teach their dogs to be good, but dogs don't have morality. Dogs are not moral creatures. What we call good just means they're doing things that we like. So they're not empirically good to that dog. We need to reinforce the things we like, and they'll do it more.
And I think that's true even in moral species, to be honest. Like, even in humans, I think a lot of what makes individuals moral is a social connectedness, a caring about what the group thinks. So a lot of people do the right thing because what other people think of them matters. That's a currency that's really valuable. And it's hard to say like what moral means. It's more of a metaphysical kind of idea. But I think that dogs, a lot of dogs are very responsive to, of course, treats and toys and getting chew things and getting to go outside. But I think they also are very connected to the idea of being like loved and cared for and approved of. But I think sometimes they don't always know so much what they're approved of if it doesn't come with these sort of other more tangible payments.
Yeah, absolutely. So it comes a lot from, the alpha theory, like you said, when we were studying a captive wolf pack. And, God bless them. I'm sure they were doing the best research at the moment that they could. But a lot of the things that came out of that study that are still influencing people doing dog training today, we've known for a really long time, don't affect dogs for two reasons. One, like you said, they're not as closely related as canines as we originally thought. So maybe it doesn't matter as much what wolves do. And two, since that was a captive pack and now we've studied wild packs, we understand that the data that we gathered from that pack as far as behavior is not really relevant.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I mean, even researchers on that study have, said that they don't think that the work that they did that showed this sort of specific ideas about alpha and dominance should be applied, and that it has been, misconstrued and misinterpreted and misapplied. It's not the kind of guiding principles that the original researchers, which I think these studies were published like in the 1960s, it's not what they think either. So I think that is really important. And I mean, this is how science works. It's what makes it exciting. We learn things and we act on them, and then we learn new things and then we adjust how we act. So I think it's all part of a really important scientific process. Like what we know changes as we learn more and more studies are done and we act accordingly. I mean, I've been training dogs for 25 years and I do things differently now than I used to. I use play a lot more than I used to. I found that to be really powerful. I'm much more generous in my reinforcements because I've learned how important it is to use really good, high quality and copious amounts of reinforcement. So, we all change and grow with what we know and learn.
Yeah, I love that. And so to wrap that up, I hope the wind is shifting. I really hope that we've convinced some people that, it may seem like, because there's a lot of people with a lot of visibility that are doing things differently, but I hope that you can see that the people who are looking at the research and looking at, just all the dogs that they're putting their hands on, I'm seeing the damage that these prong collars are doing to scared dogs. And then we have a lot of work to do to build up that dog's confidence afterwards, so I hope that we can kind of convince people that this is the way that things should go for the dog's welfare. And I wanted to close it with mentioning this is fairly new statement, a position statement that came out by the American Veterinary Society of Animal Behavior. And basically just saying, evidence supports the use of reward-based methods for all canine training. The AVSAB promotes interactions with animals based on compassion, respect, and scientific evidence. Based on these factors, reward-based learning offers the most advantages and the least harm to the learner's welfare. So it says research supports the efficacy of reward-based training to address unwanted and challenging behaviors. There's no evidence that aversive training is necessary for dog training or behavior modification. And I think it's awesome.
Yeah, I do too. And it's wonderful to hear the veterinarians who are board certified in behavior officially saying with a position statement what certified applied animal behaviorists have been saying, for decades. It's really, it's just so important that it be coming from all sorts of ways that people with dogs will be getting this information. So I was really pleased to see this position statement. And I do think things are changing. I feel like more and more people all the time are using positive training methods. I do think, it's been, 20 or 30 years that there have been crossover trainers who are changing over. And I just feel like positive training is just a bigger force in society than it ever has. And there's still many people that hopefully will be exposed to these positive methods and find them compelling and want to use them instead of aversive ones, I do think that the trend has been in the right direction for a long time, and that's exciting.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. Yay. Was there anything else that you wanted to mention before we sign off?
Well, I would just say that one thing I think that is so compelling for convincing people to use positive methods is not so much data or hearing about it or information, but actually being able to work with a positive trainer and seeing that it works. I think when people want to be able to have control in a nice way, not a harsh way, of their dog's behavior, so they can let them off leash at the park, or they can enjoy a walk with them, or they can leave them alone in the house without, coming home to with their fingers crossed, hoping the house is not a total disaster zone. And if they get the experience working with positive trainers who can teach them how to use these techniques to train their dogs so they can enjoy them even more, I think that's what one of the most compelling things is, oh, look, I have these powerful positive reinforcement strategies and techniques to help my dog behave how I want him or her to behave. I think that is the most convincing thing for anyone.
Thank you, Dr. London, for joining me today. My biggest takeaway from this conversation is that methods matter. And it's not just the use of positive reinforcement in training, but the absence of punishment that makes a dog feel safe. If you're feeling frustrated and feeling like the positive techniques aren't effective, reach out to a qualified positive trainer to help you troubleshoot. Could be a minor timing issue or about finding things your dog finds more reinforcing, but together you can make it work. Thanks for coming to the dojo to learn with me this week. This is your aspiring sensei, Susan Light, signing off. If you'd like to find me, I'm at doggydojopodcast.com or I'm at Susan Light LA on Pinterest, Instagram, and Facebook. The music was written by Mac Light. You can find him at maclightsongwriter.com. If you liked the show, you can support it by subscribing, sharing it with your friends, rating it, and reviewing it on Apple Podcasts. See you in 2 weeks with another new episode of the Doggy Dojo.